Hello and welcome to the Oxford Media Convention. I'm Damian Collins, and for this session we will be recording the panel discussion in conjunction with the Infotagion podcast that I host. And for those of you who are regular listeners to the podcast, we also have Charles Creel, who's the regular guest, who will be joining us towards the end of the discussion. But first, I'd just like to introduce our speaker guests, Maricha Sharka, the International Policy Director at the Cyber Policy Centre at Stanford University, Ben Scott, Executive Director of Reset, and Professor Lorna Woods, Professor of Internet Law at the University of Essex. I wonder if I could come to you first, Maricha. Does this feel like, when we talk about the idea of a rule of internet for the common good, that we're at a really important moment in this debate where we're seeing legislators around the world, governments around the world, looking very, very seriously about what good governance online means in terms of the law? And this could be a moment in history we look back on and say, well, this was the point when things really started to change.
Well, absolutely. That's what I always tell my Stanford students. I try to encourage them to be part of that change that I think is going to happen over the next decade, where I believe that the laws that seek to preserve the rule of law as such, democracy as such, and the core pillars of our democratic system in light of the technological disruption will be written. So I couldn't agree more. I just wanted to see if people on this webinar, and by the way, thank you for inviting me, have also followed the spat between President Biden and Facebook about COVID disinformation over the weekend. If you haven't seen it, please have a look. But one of the fascinating and also deeply troubling takeaways from that incident confrontation, and frankly, from most incidents that involve Facebook, is the fact that the company itself doesn't know the ways in which information travels over its data and advertising architecture specifically. It could know, but it doesn't dedicate the resources. And that lack of insight is certainly not helped by denying academic or other independent researchers access to key data. Too much power and control without oversight, again, leads to problems. And it's therefore not surprising, as Damian said, to see that many legislations are taking the initiative to make the liabilities and responsibilities for tech companies more clear. Now, applying regulations to new technologies to ensure consumer safety, fair competition, non-discrimination, independent oversight, and accountability, just to name a few of the democratic anchors, has been lagging behind compared to many, many other sectors, from pharma to transportation, chemicals to banking. I'm going to look at the UK's various initiatives that are aiming to bolster trust and antitrust, cybersecurity and rights protections, and are clearly initiatives that fall in line with efforts that we see in many parts of the democratic world. And the UK hasn't typically been known to be against markets. So the whole myth that regulation stifles growth and innovation can hopefully be pierced once and for all. I strongly believe that the public interest needs to be strengthened in everything digital, because when we boil it down, companies are governing without a legitimate mandate and hurt the agency of democratic governments and citizens alike in that way. And the whole structure of digitization, so much power going to tech companies, really lacks systematic accountability. So it's going to be interesting to see how the various regulatory efforts that the UK government is taking are now going to deliver, not only at home, but also in relations to neighbors, specifically that one big one, allies and other jurisdictions around the world. Clearly, there's no lack of ambition, but as always with legislation, the devil will be in the details. And it really reminds me, if I look at the full package of digital legislative initiatives, of this avalanche of EU regulations, where I always ask lawmakers and wonder out loud, how will all these different pieces of the puzzle come together and come out of the political cycle? How will they be implemented, and will they join together? Because the risk with different initiatives is that there will be cracks between which can be exploited, unfortunately. Now, when we look at main questions for the United Kingdom to answer in relation to other international actors, I think the whole effect of Brexit still needs to play out. Many of the UK's initiatives have a similar focus to that in the EU, looking at markets, competition, content moderation, data governance, cybersecurity, digital identity, and AI. But to what extent will the UK want to align with the EU or instead seek bilateral, perhaps Commonwealth connections, such as the ones with India? And can it succeed in doing both? Can the UK become the, quote, tech capital of Europe, as I've read is an ambition? Or will companies like banks and financial service companies rather seek to find that capital in the EU itself? And where will the UK come out in relation to the General Data Protection Regulation? Will it seek a different type of data protection or align with the EU? What are the trade-offs between the public interest and a push to lower standards in this effort to become a global business hub? We could read that Oliver Dowden has said that he will take an unashamedly pro-tech and deregulatory approach. Now, I'm not sure what a pro-tech approach means because technology can be designed and governed in endlessly different ways. And I'm personally certainly not against tech, but this approach really sounds more synonymous for pro-business. And I personally believe that regulations should serve and preserve the public interest, like non-discrimination, safety and security, as well as rights protections at this crucial moment in time. I think business has had a near free rein for too long if we look at tech. So in a sense, the UK, if it wants to take a deregulatory approach, is taking a counter-current approach because both the US and the EU are clearly and ambitiously stepping up regulatory interventions. There is a momentum, and I think it's an important momentum, for more collaboration between democracies worldwide to push back against techno-authoritarianism, but also against the privatized governance of everything digital. And I think that the ability to put democratic principles first at home, so in the UK, will clearly determine the extent to which the UK, as well as other democracies, can take on a credible global leadership role. So I hope that the government will feel a commitment to this urgent agenda and will look at which interventions are needed through that pro-public, pro-democracy lens. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Ben, it'd be good to get your thoughts on this area as well.
Pleasure. Thanks, Damian. Great to be here. I want to pick up on a couple of points that Maricha made and offer a few more comments to get us started. I think she's absolutely right that one of the reasons why government is struggling to deal with this set of problems around big tech, democracy, and media is there's no one solution that can fix the problems. And government does best when a single ministry can own a single problem and address it with a single policy that falls within its jurisdiction. Somebody gets to have a press conference, they announce the answer, problem solved. It just doesn't work that way here. Here we're talking about systemic change in the way that media and technology impact society and public governance. And there's just no one way to go at the problem. So I've been watching this now for many years, and sort of broad strokes, I can see three main ways in which governments are trying to get at these problems. The first and most common way is through the lens of public safety. There are bad things happening on the internet, and they are completely unrestricted, and the companies are doing too little and too late to address it. Child predation, public health disinformation, the intentional manipulation of elections, terrorist content online. These are all things that are clearly illegal. You can't do them offline. You shouldn't be able to do them online, and yet they are being done online in ways and at scopes that we've never seen before. What can be done about this? So many countries have begun to make laws that look at how to identify illegal content, notify it to the companies, and get it pulled down in a short period of time. This sort of public safety lens, I think, is really important, but it often is overstated in how much of the problem it can solve. And the reason is that when you really look under the hood and you start to understand the way in which digital media has a corrosive effect on social welfare and democratic integrity, actually the amount of content that is clearly illegal that is contributing to that problem is small. It is the tip of the iceberg. The real problem isn't that there is crazy speech on the internet. There's always been crazy speech on the internet. The problem is that the companies that are distribution monopolies, your Facebooks, your YouTubes, your Twitters, they own particular market segments, and really they have a scope unlike any media company we've ever seen in history. The way their business model works is to maximize the amount of time that their users spend staring at the screen. And the way that they get people to spend more time staring at the screen is they put really provocative, sensational content in front of you more often than you would experience it in normal life or in the consumption of conventional media. They reach out to the edges of the marketplace of ideas. They pull in the most extreme things they can find, and they give it to you as frequently as possible. And we're all human beings, and so we're attracted to that kind of thing, and we spend more time online, and they show us more ads, and they make more money. But in the process, what's happened is we have really undermined a fact-based media system. We have encouraged conspiracy theories to go far and wide and to become normalized. This is what Renee DiResta, who's a colleague at Maricha's at Stanford, calls the difference between freedom of speech and freedom of reach. No one disputes your right to say something crazy online. What we dispute is the right to demand that Facebook amplify that crazy speech disproportionately, way beyond what it would normally reach in terms of the size of the audience. So it's fine if I'm over in the corner talking to my 10 crazy friends about a conspiracy theory about COVID. That's not illegal. And it's probably not even damaging to the public. But when Facebook takes that content and puts it in front of 10 million people, that's not something that I did. I don't have an audience of 10 million people. Facebook did that for its own reasons and not for mine. And that's the distinction we're getting at. And you can't solve that problem using content regulation in the way that you can solve for illegal content. So we come to a sort of trap when we start to look at content regulation as the only way to deal with the big tech problem. So the second major way that governments have been looking at this is through the lens of monopoly. Never before have we had such concentration of power in the distribution of media. This is a huge problem. There are antitrust regulators all over the world who are looking at it. It's a long game to fix this problem through competition policy. And it's not even clear, to me at least, that breaking up these companies necessarily leads you to a better outcome for democracy and social welfare. It could lead to a race to the bottom if we don't change the incentives about how and why these businesses do what they do. So important aspects of this problem can be solved with competition policy, but again, it's insufficient. So the third major approach, and this is one which is, I think, the hardest for legislators to get their heads around, is the problem of data. This entire business works on a principle which my friend Shoshana Zuboff at Harvard calls extraction, which is a great word, very evocative. It is the process by which companies like Facebook and Google take your digital behavior, everything you do online, and turn it into streams of data. And they take that data and they turn it into profiles, extremely detailed profiles about everything you do, every website you visit, every click, every mouse stroke, every purchase, and they store it in a profile about you. And then they sell that information about you and everybody like you to advertisers to better target you with messages. And they use that information to shape a personalized media experience for you that is designed to keep you glued to your screen for as long as possible. That process of extraction is done supposedly with your consent. When you click, I agree, I want a Google account because I just paid $1,000 for a phone, you have agreed to let them collect whatever data they want for as long as they want and do whatever they want with it. When you open a Facebook account, you have agreed to total surveillance. No normal mortal understands that clicking I agree is setting you up for that kind of total extraction of your digital life into a data file that is then stored and compiled and updated every day about you. That's the source of the problem. That's the reason why concentrated power in the market is such a problem, is they have such a massive amount of data and they can use it to allow others to manipulate us. And it's also the reason why we are so susceptible to the distortive effects of artificial amplification. It's because they know so much about us. They are very good at pushing our buttons by sending us content that keeps us glued to the screens. So these are the three areas that I think we ought to look at. You can see them teed up in the online safety bill in Britain. You can see them being wrestled with at the ICO and at the Competition and Markets Authority. You can see them in select committees like the one that Damian chaired on Cambridge Analytica. These are the core issues: public safety and the problem of illegal content, monopoly and the problem of market concentration in digital media, and the problem of extraction, the datafication of digital life without our informed consent that drives all of the other problems in this ecosystem. And these are the issues we've got to get at as governments.
Thanks so much, Ben. I think it's a really great point that the issue around data is not just about how data is gathered from users, but what it's then used for by the companies. But Lorna, it'd be really great to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Thanks, Damian. I suppose I'm going to follow up on Ben's three themes, and I suppose focus on 1 and 3, because I think in terms of looking at the problem content and looking at the harms that may end up being caused to users in service of the extraction industry, we're seeing two main models of response. Now, the first one is the content-focused model. So that is direct regulation of content. And the main responses to that are assuming that the platform is neutral as to the content provided, and to focus on how you take content down. And that is really quite difficult. Partly there's the simple questions of scale and speed, also context, and particularly context when you look at the pan national nature of the platforms. So while I think there is always a case for taking down content contrary to the criminal law, the child abuse and the like, I don't think it's enough. The other model is something I've called systemic. And by that, I mean it focuses on the software, the business model of the platform. And in a way, it is, well, I've said health and safety on the internet or product safety. Marija mentioned that Facebook does not know how its systems work, although it could know how they work. And I suppose my question is, how are we letting people launch products onto the market where they don't seem to think very clearly about the consequences? So a systems-based model is really asking companies, as they search for ever more user engagement, to look at, I suppose, the downside of those systems. What happens when this program scales? What happens when the bad people get a hold of it? And I think just relying on users to flag problems or to take care of themselves is insufficient. So we're now seeing a range of responses around the globe. And I think we see a mix of these approaches. I've not read the recent Australian Act in detail, but I think it is taking a more content-focused approach. It seems to be looking at how things are taken down effectively. And you can see that in the NetzDG. And you can also see it as part one of the Digital Services Act. But I think there are also systems-based approaches. The Australians earlier had a code talking about safety by design. It looked towards the end of the distribution chain, I think, rather than looking at the entire nature of the system. But it certainly looked at some of the design features. the proposal in the Digital Services Act for the due diligence obligation on very large online platforms also can be seen as this systemic approach. And that's looking at companies to do some form of risk assessment. And we can see this also in the UK's online safety bill. And I would say it's probably more purely systemic than perhaps other proposals. If you look at the online safety objectives that are in the draft bill, to look at the risk profile of the platform, to look at its features, how users engage with it. Though it does expect illegal content to be taken down, and it does see the world through types of content. So it distinguishes between illegal content, content harmful for children, and then content harmful for adults. So it's got potential, I think, as a systemic regime. It's not perfect. I think part of the problem is that it's a framework bill. Now, on one level, that's not a problem. We want an independent regulator to go away and give us evidence-based suggestions as to what's good, what's bad, what's ugly. But it makes it hard to assess what's going on in the legislation itself. Perhaps more problematically is that in dividing things into these three elements, we have got quite a complex structure. And so there are going to be questions about whether there are gaps, how this works together, and that is just much more difficult to understand. And I think the real weakness in this draft bill is content that has been called harmful but legal. And this is the stuff that Ben was talking about, the COVID disinformation, these sorts of issues that may not actually be contrary to the criminal law, but that in other contexts we would regulate. So that, I think, is going to be an area where there has to be a lot of discussion. One final point is, what about edgy speech? What about vigorous democratic discussions? Well, the draft bill does recognise both the position of the media, and it recognises the importance of democratic speech. In terms of how well these are going to work, or what they do, again, it's hard to assess, but I have concerns that while we don't want to double regulate the media, the provisions relating to the media that we've got at the moment are both over-inclusive, that it could be exploited as a loophole, and under-inclusive in that it has quite a narrow view of what the media looks like these days. It seems to be built on a traditional media organisation from about, 1989. The democratic debate provision, it doesn't require particular responses. There will be presumably codes of conduct from Ofcom. But this is one area where I think it is too soon to judge whether it actually adds anything or, again, creates a loophole. And I think for the time being, that's all I want to say.
Thank you so much, Lorna. I think you're right to characterise the online safety bill as a systems-based approach. And that makes it actually quite different from what self-regulation looks like in the tech industry. Because you think, look at the way the Facebook Oversight Board works, it removes really any function of Facebook in the process of harmful content being posted and removed, other than the fact they take it down or they don't take it down. The idea that they actively promote it and recommend it to people is beyond the scope of the oversight board. They're not allowed to see how that works, and yet actually that's central to the approach that's been proposed here. I think interesting question though, which you touched on. I'd like to ask you and to get to Maricha and Ben's view on as well, is that it requires subjective judgments, But then again, in Facebook's own terms and conditions, it says it doesn't allow hate speech. So I think what the regulator will do is, so what does that actually mean? How do you define it, and what will you do when you see it? And are you effective at doing it? Imagine if we lived in a world where everyone understood what the terms and conditions of the platforms were, that they were simply understandable, and there was a legal requirement that they acted on it all the time. We'd be in a radically different place if that was, even if we achieved that. And it strikes me a lot of these systems-based approaches to regulation are trying to do just that: make the terms of service understandable, definable, and then hold them to account in terms of whether they actually enforce them.
I think you're right that if the platforms enforce their terms of terms of service, then we would be in a different place. And I think it would be hugely helpful if they also enforce those conditions consistently and fairly, because I think there are always stories about how a social media platform has left up that which it should not have, while taking down something that seems quite anodyne or harmless. But I think we need to push further, because saying that we are talking about terms of service, in a way, still leaves room for the platform to set its own terms of service and question how do we feel about that. But also, it doesn't address the incentives that the platforms give to the more outrageous, provocative content, and the extent to which they have thought about how those systems that they've set up, which are essentially broadcasting systems, how they can be used and abused. So I think terms of service and enforcement of terms of service go some way. I don't think it's enough.
Maricha, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that governments in democracies really have to make a choice of what is appropriate as a role of companies, and especially tech companies, to govern. And that balance between the public interest and privatized governance has gone completely off. Essentially, the whole, not only monopoly on markets, but also monopoly on knowledge, the ability to see where disinformation flows, but also the ability to learn from new AI applications, to see what goes well, what doesn't go well, is all shielded from the public. And it worries me a great deal that this information lag, basically, on the part of the public, whether it be parliamentarians or journalists or civil society organizations or regulators, is sort of exponentially growing out of balance. And so I think there are, on the one hand, sort of horizontal or foundational aspects that need to be regulated for, so meaningful access to information, transparency, and accountability. And on the other hand, more sectoral or vertical requirements. For example, the way in which data is governed. It's another good point that Ben made, but we'll have different requirements when we think about the healthcare sector, for example, versus industry, right? I mean, industrial data coming out of car factories will have a different sensitivity, although from a security point of view or prevention of espionage could be very sensitive, but it has a different type of sensitivity than very personal healthcare data, for example. And so I think the need to combine these provisional, horizontally applicable requirements, balancing back towards protecting the public interest and public access to information, should be combined with sectoral specific regulations. And I sometimes miss that kind of pattern between the two when I look at different regulatory efforts, because on the one hand, as Ben also pointed out, the way in which policy is organized is not exactly in sync with how the technology works and disrupts. And sometimes we try to overlay the digital reality with the sort of traditional policy frameworks. And instead, I think we need to look at what the real problems are and come up with innovative solutions as well. Sometimes one principal solution can really have broad ripple effects, which could be positive if they're done well. So it is indeed complicated, and it's very important to make sure that there's not cracks that can be exploited between these different efforts, which I worry about quite a bit when I look at both the packages in the UK and in the EU, for example.
Thank you. I mean, Ben, when you spoke about data usage and amplification, in some ways that would create a sliding scale of harm, that a company may have failed in its duty of care because it didn't remove a piece of harmful content, but the offence will be even greater if it had actively amplified that same content.
Yeah, that's exactly the point that I wanted to make, which is a few months ago, the Wall Street Journal reported on a leaked internal document from Facebook, which is often when we learn the most about how Facebook actually works. And that internal document was written by engineers on their integrity team. That's the team that looks at how their product is unsafe and harms its users. And the integrity team said, hey, we've taken a look at Facebook users who are joining extremist Facebook groups, white supremacy groups in particular, conspiracy theories about a stolen election. And what we're finding is that more than 60% of the people who join those groups are joining because the Facebook algorithm recommended that they go to those pages. They didn't find them on their own. That wasn't like somebody put a message in their newsfeed and they clicked on it and they went over there. It's that Facebook told them, hey, we think you might be interested in this white supremacy group over here. Why don't you check it out? And obviously nobody at Facebook made that decision as an individual. That's the algorithm that is doing that. You don't fix that problem with a content regulation or with an oversight board that looks at individual pieces of harmful content. If we're talking about the whack-a-mole game of, is this post a violation of the rules or not, we're losing. We are working on the terms that the companies would like us to work on. We are tinkering at the edges. We are not looking systemically. So there are two ways that I can see in current legislative proposals to look systemically. One is we've talked about already, which is, hey, if you're going to have terms of service that say this kind of thing is not allowed, you actually have to enforce it. So this is the online safety bill. The online safety bill says government is not going to tell companies to delete speech which is not illegal. That is not what we do in democratic societies. But if you as a company say you don't allow hate speech and you don't allow public health disinformation and you don't allow false claims about the outcome of elections, then we expect you to actually deliver on those terms of service. We're going to go and look to see whether you have consistently applied your terms of service. And if you haven't, then you are in violation not of a speech regulation, you're in violation of consumer protection. You said you were going to deliver a product that did this and you didn't do it. So that is the regulatory hook that allows you to say, we're going to hold you accountable for what you say you're going to do, but what you never actually do. The second way to do it is the way the Digital Services Act does it, which is to say, we're going to make you in advance tell us how you're going to deal with these systemic risks. We all know that your algorithm is promoting content that would not otherwise be sought out or found, and that is a primary mechanism of distortion that social media causes. How are you taking proactive steps to address that? And then to determine whether the steps proposed by the companies are credible, and then again, auditing them to make sure that they're actually doing what they say they're doing. These companies have consistently made claims about what they are doing to address problems, knowing damn well that there's no way that anybody can verify whether they're doing it or not. That is a terrible way for us to go about regulating these firms. We would never let any other industry do that. Imagine if AstraZeneca said, you know what, we've identified some side effects for the vaccine and we know what they are and we know who's suffering from them, but we're going to not tell you who those people are or exactly what the side effects are or the scope of the damage. But trust us, we're going to deal with that right away and it's going to be great. It wouldn't pass the laugh test. No one would put up with that for a second. Why are we putting up with it when it comes to disinformation, which has a similar public health effect? People saying, well, I'm not going to take a vaccine at all.
Thanks a lot, Ben. We've got some questions coming in from the audience. And first one I'd like to put to you is, when we talk about freedom of speech on social media, how much of this is actually real people? And how much of this is speech that is fabricated and created, particularly by foreign states, to try and influence politics and society and cause divisions in other countries, particularly in democracies in Europe and America. Perhaps, Maricha, I can see you nodding. Perhaps you'd like to start us off with that.
Yeah, thank you. It is a really important question, because we shouldn't only look at content, but also at the methods and maybe the incentives that are at play for why people may want to polarize or spread false information. And it is well known that foreign actors are interested in undermining liberal democracy and a healthy public debate, which is an integral part, of course, of democratic society, but also very cynically through commercially motivated disinformation. There were people selling all kinds of nonsensical alleged treatments for COVID, for example, in an effort to make money. And so it is very important to also look at the behavior, the way in which actors are trying to manipulate. And so I've always benefited a great deal from a paper by Camille Francois, who is a disinformation expert. And she has this so-called ABC model that says you have to look at the actors. So who is interested in sharing dis and misinformation, lies, falsehoods, polarizing content? What is their behavior? So, for example, if we see uploads of a tweet every 3 seconds for 72 hours straight, it is most likely not a human being posting that text. And then thirdly, content. And what tends to happen in the debate about how to handle platform responsibility, content moderation online, is that there's an enormous focus on content, which makes it quite problematic because, of course, we have to cherish the freedom of expression, and touching on what can and cannot be said is always sensitive. This boundary between illegal and legal, often quite vague. But when we start shifting our attention to that behavior, those patterns, those bots, those amplifications, those gamings of the system, those uses of the advertising models that the big social media platforms have, and trying to understand the actors behind it, we get a much more complete picture, and also different avenues to change and to hold them to account.
Thank you. Ben, for the work you and your team do at Reset, how much do you think foreign interference is a problem on social media?
I think it's a problem, but I think we shouldn't overstate the degree to which foreign interference is responsible for the chaos in our marketplace for ideas. I think what foreign interference mainly does is it takes advantage of the way in which social media is already polluting the public sphere and distorting the conversation by elevating extreme voices, by amplifying provocative and polarizing rhetoric. If you're Russia, you don't need to create a propaganda message. All you have to do is pile on to what Facebook is already promoting to enhance social division, to enhance public distrust in institutions. So a small amount of foreign interference can go a long way. And I think we shouldn't understate the degree to which it's relevant and a critical part of this problem, but it is preying on weaknesses that are already in the system. And again, I think it comes back to we have to open the black box that these companies operate. The fact that we leave it up to them to see whether the Russians are trying to interfere in domestic politics is ridiculous. Why would they not want the best scholars in national security in the world to be poring over that data to make sure that we have the most intelligent assessment of which actors are engaged in what behavior to promote what content, and is it an illegal action or not? And these are fundamental questions of public safety, fundamental questions of national security that are being obstructed in the name of private profit. And I think it's not much more complicated than that.
Lorna, what are your thoughts?
I find the freedom of speech argument quite difficult because it sits against certain assumptions that all speech is visible to all. And I think the nature of the social media environment is that the marketplace of ideas doesn't work very well because we don't know where messages are coming from. We can't assess who's speaking or why, which we do in normal contents. We take a view on whether somebody's got an ulterior motive or a benefit out of speaking. We don't know what others are seeing. And so counter-speech narratives also don't work particularly well because you can't ensure that everybody's able to participate in the debate and to weigh up different perspectives, different statements as to what the case is. So I think this is a problem whether or not a state actor is behind it. But it is clearly ripe for manipulation if they do want to act.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to quickly put one more question, and then I'd like to invite Charles to come in and ask some questions as well. Looking at the time, we have to be reasonably quick, I think. But firstly, just we've had questions about the international scope of regulation and also interoperability as well. I mean, how do you think we should deal with the problem of different rules in different countries and also harmful content being shared between platforms where the platform policies might be different?
Is that me?
You want to start us off, Lorna? We'll go back round the other way and then finish with Maricha.
Okay. Well, I'll start with international standards. Getting agreements on content is very, very difficult because the cultural context, history, and all sorts. It's just fiendishly difficult. So I think if you were looking for international agreement at the direct content regulation level, it would be difficult. I think it may be more possible if we are talking about the processes within the companies, because that is more neutral. You might have questions about what sorts of disinformation or what sorts of sort of criminal content is running across them. But in a way, the processes, the risk assessment and risk mitigation measures should be at one level similar. So that allows for a certain interoperability, at least across jurisdictions. The question about interoperability between platforms is more difficult. I suppose one way is to think about institutions that can act as a clearinghouse, a space where information is shared. But then platforms would probably need perhaps an obligation to cooperate. You can look at terms of service. Do platforms take into account behavior on other platforms, for example? I don't know whether there are effective solutions about, organising pylons on one platform to take place on another, unless you've got a lot of cooperation between the platforms, which I don't think is currently the case.
Ben, what are your thoughts?
So, I think there's a great deal of opportunity for international dialogue about setting common rules. And the International Grand Committee on Disinformation, Damian, that you helped get started, I think is a great example of the interest that you see in international dialogue on setting common standards. I think ultimately all these policies are going to be made domestically, but I think there's room for alignment. For example, current discussions about setting minimum tax rates for big tech companies that are cheating. I think that's a great example of governments coming together and recognizing a common interest. I think national security cooperation to fight against foreign threats that are common to many countries is another good example. The third one I'll point out briefly is data protection law. And here I'll put a plug in that the UK should, at its peril, decide to weaken data protection standards post-Brexit. The general data protection regulation is a great idea, and someone should really try it The problem we have with data protection law is that it has not been enforced. Our greatest opportunity to hold these big tech companies in check and to deal with the problem of extraction requires no new law. It requires the enforcement of existing law and regulators with both the resources and the political courage to act on the plain text of existing law. What these companies are doing, extracting all of our digital lives and putting them into data profiles and selling them to the highest bidder, this is plainly illegal under current law. And it's only the business of clever lawyers that has interpreted it away and the weakness of regulators that allows it to go on. And that is something that could be done across the European Union and in the UK immediately and set a standard for 500 million consumers overnight. That would be an extraordinary step and one that could be taken in the months ahead.
Thank you. Maricha.
I think it's really important to look at the global context for why regulations are necessary, including data protection, but also antitrust. So if we look at the United States with a very strong tech sector when it comes to platforms, for example, the fact that there is no data protection regulation there on the federal level also makes it harder for the US to entice or convince others to uphold certain standards. So how are you, in an international context, going to propagate a shared, let's say, democratic data governance model on the basis of a vacuum, on the basis of not regulating? It's really unconvincing and challenging to negotiate on that basis. So I agree that having as broadly shared as possible principles such as data protection, but also antitrust, for example, which I think is a really important component of what needs to change. We need a reinterpretation of antitrust rules to apply to the current business models and massive data collections that we see on the part of tech companies. And on the latter part, on the antitrust part, I'm optimistic. I see a lot of convergence. I think there's a lot changing in the United States, which has long had a hands-off approach. And the Biden administration is embracing this notion of stronger collaboration globally between democracies, particularly when it comes to governing tech. And it is high time. So for the UK, indeed, the decision of whether to align with the EU, which I hope will be possible as much as will continue as much as possible, despite the unfortunate Brexit decision, will really be a key vector for how it can be part of this critical mass and be part of this democratic coalition. And that's why I mentioned in my introduction that if the UK seeks to deregulate when it comes to tech, it's really going against the trend that we see in the US and the EU. And instead, I hope there can be sort of an alignment really to strengthen democracy and the agency of democratic governments, the protection of the public interest in light of these technological disruptions, which come from the industry, but also, of course, from the way in which tech is used by authoritarian regimes. So over the past 10 years, democracy has been in decline globally, and the tech sector has mushroomed. And so this combination of factors should really make us think and put democracy first.
Thank you so much. Now, it's great to have Charles Krill with us today, just as he is on the Infotagion podcast. I know that regular listeners to the podcast know, Charles, you travel around the world a bit. Where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining you from Alabama, where it's about 4:30 in the morning, and only 30% of us are vaccinated here.
It's great to have you with us. What are your thoughts listening to the discussion?
Thanks. Well, the vaccination thing is a kind of lead into one of my questions. I mean, one of the problems that we're having here is that anybody could get vaccinated that wants to get vaccinated, but only 30% of people are willing to get vaccinated. And what has happened is that the mainstream has picked up anti-vaccination rhetoric here in Alabama, but it's happening across the United States and around the world. And it seems that this is our next great healthcare crisis that we're about to confront, and we're confronting it immediately, is anti-vax rhetoric. Now, the Center for Countering Digital Hate, Imran Ahmed's organization in DC, came out with a report about the disinformation dozen, that 2/3 of anti-vax rhetoric is coming from about 12 people who are profiteering off of this. But what's not mentioned is that they're actually often preying on vulnerable people who are susceptible to really ridiculous notions that might be out in the space. And right now, even as we're talking, like 1 out of 6 people in the United States believe that the country is run by a group of satanic blood-drinking pedophiles. So these ideas are getting picked up in a space of vulnerability and then transmitted onto the mainstream. And I'm wondering are there additional steps? Are there interventionist steps? Are there education steps? Are there steps of care that governments can take in order to stop this kind of transmission of information through vulnerable channels? And I put that out to anybody.
Sure, I'm happy to start. I think it is essential that governments indeed see the multiple harms to public health, for example. So that immediately pulls it away from this question of free speech, but really looks at where freedom of expression clashes with the need to protect public health. And we can see the same with public order or national security, where essentially the front line of protection lies with companies in invisible ways. We just simply don't know whether they're doing enough, whether they could do more, whether there's information that could truly inform public policy here. And so essentially we see that tech companies are essentially taking public policy decisions without the mandate, without the accountability. And so I would say clarity on what is and is not appropriate to leave to companies, tech companies in this case, is an important step. To have more transparency into the decisions they make or don't make, and to have independent oversight. And that brings me back to the point of meaningful access to information. How can independent researchers or journalists or civil society organizations even begin to assess what is going on without that access to information? How can parliamentarians and other politicians make fact-based policy decisions without understanding the real problem? And so if we don't tackle that meaningful access to information, and I don't mean putting algorithms on the front page of The Guardian or something, because nobody would understand, but it's about the right access to information for the right people in order to assess where these companies are operating as intended, where they might be violating existing laws, and where there's new realities, ever-changing realities that need to be addressed with updates to legislation, updates to oversight, new types of sanctions that actually bite instead of being considered as the cost of doing business. There's a whole host of things that will probably flow in a much better informed way if that access to information can be ensured.
I'll go next. I'd just like to go back to what I was saying about systemic regulation. I'd say that companies should be looking at how content is created and who creates it. This is not to say I want to see a ban on anonymity or anything like that, but I think companies should, for example, consider whether they want to allow bot networks operating on their systems, and to think about the risk factors that gives rise to, so that, are people exploiting the system? Are these 12 people able to spread disinformation on a mass scale by having multiple accounts or using bots? And the same thing goes with the sort of the recommendation and navigation tools. How are they playing into this? Are they promoting the counter narrative? Do they value authoritative sources of information? And then at the third stage, when you get to the recipient user, are companies thinking about how fast information flows, or whether it is valuable to put some limits on the ease of forwarding, so that people can maybe let their brains catch up with their fingers on the screen and check whether they actually trust this information, have even read beyond the headline, and those sorts of things. But also, what is the role of trusted flaggers? Are they taken seriously, or are they just fed into the same complaint system that takes 3 weeks to respond with an automated we'll get to it message? So those are 3 stages. But it does also presuppose that there are people there providing the counter message.
I know we're almost out of time, so I'll give one extra minute and I'll come back to where Maricha started with Joe Biden's comment that Facebook is killing people, and then his slight backpedal that maybe they aren't doing it intentionally, but people on Facebook are contributing to lower rates of vaccine adoption and therefore higher rates of death. It's simply undeniable that the spread of misinformation about COVID is leading to a higher rate of death. And we have a lot of evidence that Facebook is at minimum guilty of malign neglect. There's a great story by Shira Frankel in the New York Times today about how internally engineers came forward to executives and said, we see the misinformation about vaccines going like wildfire. Here are ways we can systemically reduce it. And those proposals were tabled. And let me read you this quote from Brian Boland, who recently quit his post as a vice president at Facebook. He said, one of the main reasons that I left Facebook is that the most senior leadership in the company does not want to invest in understanding the impact of its core products, and it doesn't want to make the data available for others to do the hard work to hold them accountable. That's where we are. We have to do that hard work. Governments have to do that hard work, and we have to do it right away.
Thanks so much, Ben. Now, one last question, if the IPPR will let us get away with it with very short answers, would be, and it's come from Damian Tambini at the LSE, is if you had to amend the online safety bill, what would you change about it? And if you haven't got an amendment in mind, what would you say is the one thing we have to make sure the bill definitely delivers? So Lorna first, then Ben, then Maricha.
Well, I've already said that I think dividing the duty up by reference to different sorts of content is complex. I'd like to see a single overarching duty of care.
I would go with clear standards for mandatory access to data and audit of algorithmic systems to determine exactly the ways in which these products harm the public. We can't leave it up to the companies.
Yeah, I fully agree with what Ben said. And I think the idea of putting the public interest first, not outsourcing to the very tech companies whose problems we're trying to solve for, is really vital. So all the best to everyone working on it.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the IPPR Oxford Media Convention for hosting us. And thanks to the audience for your questions as well.